All right, let's go. Open that bag and hand over your ID.
Afternoon, officer. Why would I need to do that?
You fit the description. I said open it.
Sitting in a park isn't a crime. I've done nothing wrong.
Don't start with me. You want to make this harder?
I'm calm, and I know my rights. You don't have cause to search my bag.
Officer Brian Trent thought he owned every block in his district, including the park. He spotted a black man sitting quietly near the fountain, and something about that bothered him. He walked over, chest out, and started making demands that had no legal ground to stand on. Threatening arrest, threatening jail, threatening consequences. What he didn't know was that the man he was threatening had more federal authority in his back pocket than Trent had accumulated in 15 years on the force. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Marcus Webb was 41 years old, and he had spent the last 14 years doing work that most people would never know about. He was a senior undercover agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and he was very good at his job. He had worked cases in 3 different states, helped bring down 2 major drug networks, and had been commended by his supervisors more than once for his ability to blend into any environment without raising suspicion. That was the whole point of undercover work. You had to look like you belonged everywhere, even when the world kept telling you that you didn't. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Marcus was sitting on a wooden bench near the fountain in Callaway Park, wearing a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers. There was a black duffel bag resting beside his left foot. To anyone walking by, he looked like a regular man taking a break from the day. That was exactly how it was supposed to look. Marcus had been running a 7-month undercover operation, targeting a mid-level drug distribution network that used Callaway Park as one of its key handoff points. He wasn't relaxing. He was working. His eyes were calm, but his attention was everywhere. On the paths, the benches, the people moving through the park. He was waiting for a contact to show up, and the timing had to be perfect. Everything was in position. The operation was days away from its biggest breakthrough. He noticed the officer before the officer reached him. That was also part of the training. Brian Trent had been with the Maplewood Police Department for 15 years, and in that time, he had built a reputation that made other officers uncomfortable. He had been the subject of 4 internal complaints in the last 3 years alone. 3 of them filed by black men who said Trent had stopped them without cause, spoken to them with contempt, and treated public spaces like they were restricted areas that required his personal approval to enter. None of those complaints had resulted in any serious discipline. Trent had kept his badge each time, and somewhere along the way, that had taught him that there were no real consequences for the way he operated. He walked through Callaway Park that afternoon the same way he always did, like a man who had never once been told he was wrong. He spotted Marcus from about 30 feet away, a black man, alone, a bag at his feet. Trent's eyes locked on and didn't let go. He changed his direction without hesitation and started walking toward the bench with the kind of deliberate pace that was meant to feel like pressure before a single word was spoken. Marcus kept his eyes forward. He didn't turn his head. He didn't shift in his seat. He just waited. The way he had learned to wait in situations that required absolute control. Trent stopped directly in front of him, close enough to cast a shadow across Marcus's shoes. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't start with a question. He looked down at the duffel bag first, then back up at Marcus and said, "What's in the bag?" Marcus looked up slowly. "Nothing that concerns you," he said. His voice was even. No aggression, no nervousness. Just flat and steady. That answer visibly irritated Trent. His jaw tightened. "Everything in this park concerns me," he said. "ID, now." Marcus didn't reach for anything. He held Trent's gaze and said calmly, "You haven't given me a reason." The two men stared at each other for a moment that felt longer than it was. Around them, the park continued its afternoon routine. A woman pushed a stroller along the path. Two kids chased each other near the grass. An old man read a newspaper on a bench across the fountain. Nobody had noticed yet, but the air between Marcus and Trent had already shifted into something tense and uneven, and it was only going to get worse from here. Trent took one step closer to the bench, not because he had a reason to, but because closing the distance was how he reminded people who had the power in the conversation. He looked down at Marcus the way a man looks at something he has already decided is a problem, and he said, "You want to do this the hard way, that's fine by me. I've got all afternoon." Marcus didn't move. He didn't lean back, didn't look away, didn't do any of the things that people do when they're trying to shrink themselves to make someone else more comfortable. He just sat there, both feet flat on the ground, hands resting on his knees, watching Trent with an expression that gave nothing away. That stillness was not something Trent was used to. Most people, when he pressed them, either got loud or got nervous. Marcus Webb did neither, and that bothered Trent more than he wanted to show. "Last time I'm asking," Trent said, his voice dropping lower now, the kind of low that was meant to sound like a final warning. "ID out, bag open, or we're going to the station and you can explain yourself there." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "On what grounds?" he asked. The question was not a challenge. It was calm and direct, the way a man asks something when he already knows the answer and simply wants to see if the other person does too. Trent's face hardened. "Suspicious behavior," he said. "You've been sitting here for over an hour. You've got a bag you won't open. That's enough for me." "Sitting in a public park is not suspicious behavior," Marcus said quietly. That was when Trent reached for his radio. He called it in as a non-compliant individual, which was the kind of language that turned a conversation into something official, something on record, something that gave whatever came next a paper trail that would make it look justified. Within 4 minutes, a second patrol car pulled up along the park's east entrance. Officer Gary Simmons stepped out, a younger man who clearly read the situation the moment he saw Trent's posture and Marcus's composure. Simmons looked slightly uncertain, but he fell in line the way junior officers often do, when they don't yet have the confidence to question a senior colleague in the field. Now, there were two officers standing in front of the bench. A woman walking a dog slowed down nearby. She didn't stop completely, but she didn't keep moving either. A teenage boy sitting on the grass about 20 feet away had already pulled out his phone and was holding it at an angle that suggested he was recording without making it obvious. Marcus clocked both of them without turning his head. Trent pointed at the duffel bag. "Open it," he said. "Right now." Marcus's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the specific kind of frustration that comes from knowing exactly what is happening to you, and knowing that losing your composure will only make it worse. He had been in this position before, not as an undercover agent, as a black man, and the two experiences were not as different as people like to think. He breathed once, slow and controlled, and said, "I am not opening that bag without probable cause. That is my right." Trent turned to Simmons. "You see what I'm dealing with?" he said, as if Marcus wasn't sitting right there. As if he had already stopped being a person in the conversation and become a situation to be handled. Simmons didn't respond. He looked at Marcus, and something in his expression flickered. A brief, almost invisible moment of discomfort. But he stayed where he was. Trent turned back to Marcus and said, "Stand up. You're being detained." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was still calm, still even. But there was something behind those words that wasn't a threat and wasn't a plea. It was a statement delivered by someone who knew exactly what was coming next. and was giving the other man one final opportunity to change course. Trent didn't take it. He reached out and grabbed Marcus by the arm. And that was the moment everything changed. Because at the exact second Trent's hand made contact, three things happened simultaneously. A black SUV rolled slowly through the park's north entrance. A second one came in from the west, and a third stopped at the south path, engine running. Their windows were tinted, their plates were federal, and the men stepping out of them were not wearing patrol uniforms. The doors of all three SUVs opened at the same time. 8 men stepped out, moving with the kind of calm, coordinated purpose that doesn't come from local precincts. It comes from federal training. They wore dark tactical vests with 4 bold yellow letters across the chest. DEA. They fanned out across the park's entrances without rushing, without shouting, without any of the chaos that Trent had been creating over the last several minutes. They simply moved into position the way people do when they have been planning something for a very long time and everything is finally going exactly as it should. Trent froze. His hand was still on Marcus's arm, but the grip had gone loose without him realizing it. He looked at the vehicles, then at the agents, then back at the vehicles. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. The lead agent, a tall woman named Special Agent Diane Crawley, walked directly toward the bench. She didn't look at Trent when she approached. She looked at Marcus, and the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. She reached into her vest, pulled out a badge holder and a holstered weapon, and held them out toward him. Marcus stood up from the bench, took his badge and his weapon, and clipped them both into place without a word. Crawley finally turned to look at Trent. "You just grabbed a senior DEA undercover agent in the middle of an active federal operation," she said. Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "A operation," she continued, "that your department was never cleared to know about." Trent's face had gone the color of old chalk. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and what he saw was no longer the man he thought he had the authority to push around. Standing in front of him now was Agent Marcus Webb, 14 years with the DEA, badge on his hip, and an expression that was neither angry nor satisfied, just tired. The way a man looks when something has happened to him so many times that even being proven right doesn't feel like a victory anymore. The teenage boy's phone was still recording. The woman with the dog had stopped walking entirely. The park was silent, except for the sound of federal agents doing the job that Brian Trent had just nearly destroyed. By sundown, the video was everywhere. The teenage boy's footage had been uploaded within 20 minutes of the incident, and it spread the way things spread when they carry the kind of truth that people recognize immediately. The clip showed everything. Trent's aggression, Marcus's composure, the federal vehicles rolling in, and the moment Special Agent Crawley handed Marcus back his badge. It had been viewed over 2 million times before midnight, and by the next morning, the Maplewood Police Department was fielding calls from 3 different news stations and a federal oversight office. The DEA released a formal statement confirming that Agent Marcus Webb had been conducting an active undercover operation in Callaway Park as part of a 7-month federal investigation. The statement did not use soft language. It said directly that Officer Brian Trent's intervention had endangered a federal agent, disrupted an active operation, and shown a clear pattern of behavior consistent with racial bias in the field. The word pattern was important because it pointed backward to the 4 complaints that had gone nowhere, to the 3 black men who had filed reports and been ignored, to every moment the department had looked the other way and called it a judgment call. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation before the end of the business day. By the following morning, Officer Brian Trent was suspended without pay, pending a full disciplinary review. His badge and his weapon were collected. His access to the precinct was revoked. Officer Simmons was placed under a separate review for his role in the detainment. Marcus gave a single brief statement when asked by a reporter outside the federal building that evening. He didn't talk about Trent. He didn't talk about the operation. He said only this, that what happened to him in that park had happened to him before, in other parks, on other streets, in other cities, long before he ever carried a federal badge, and that the badge had not protected him. His own restraint had. He picked up his coffee, turned toward the building entrance, and walked inside. Some cases close with an arrest, some close with a verdict. This one closed with a suspension, a viral video, and a federal complaint that nobody in the Maplewood Police Department was going to make disappear. Brian Trent finally had consequences. It just took a DEA badge to make them real.
Good afternoon. Roll that window all the way down. What are you doing out here on my highway, huh?
We were on our way to a meeting, officer.
Meeting can wait. Step out of the car, both of you. Let's go. Don't make me ask twice.
Yes, sir.
And don't get cute with me. You're on the shoulder of an interstate. That's not a rest stop.
Hands where we can see him.
Officer Matt Doyle saw a black couple in a nice SUV on the interstate and made a decision in under 4 seconds. He pulled them over, approached the vehicle with attitude already loaded, and told the driver that he looked nervous, which in Doyle's mind was reason enough for anything. He threatened to search the car, threatened to call K9, and made sure they knew exactly who was in charge on that highway. What he didn't know was that he was standing between 2 federal marshals and a fugitive who was slipping further away with every second Doyle spent throwing his weight around, and that his body cam was catching every word. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, and he had spent the last 12 years doing the kind of work most people never hear about. He was a U.S. Marshal, not the kind who stands outside a courtroom door, but the kind who gets called when a dangerous fugitive slips through the cracks and nobody else can find them. He had tracked criminals across 6 states, worked cases that stretched for months, and built a reputation inside the agency as someone who was calm under pressure, no matter what the situation looked like from the outside. That calm wasn't something he was born with. It was trained into him, tested in the field, and earned through years of walking into situations where the wrong move could cost someone their life. That Tuesday evening, Marcus was behind the wheel of a black GMC Yukon, moving steadily along Interstate 78 in New Jersey. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. He was doing exactly 67 miles per hour in the right lane, keeping a careful 3-car distance between himself and a silver Honda Accord roughly 400 feet ahead of him. Inside that Accord was a man named Derek Holt, a convicted armed robber who had cut off his ankle monitor 9 days earlier and vanished. The marshals had been hunting Holt across 2 states, and that evening, after weeks of dead ends, a tip had placed him on that exact highway heading toward a motel just outside of Phillipsburg. Marcus and his partner had been trailing him quietly for the last 11 minutes, staying back far enough not to spook him, but close enough not to lose him. Sitting in the passenger seat was his wife, Dana Webb. She was 36, and she held the same federal badge he did. Dana had joined the Marshal's service 8 years ago after 4 years as a military police officer, and she was the one who had cracked the tip that put them on Holt's trail in the first place. She had spent 3 days working a network of contacts until one of them came through with a plate number and a direction. Right now, her eyes were fixed on that silver Accord, and she had her radio ready in her lap, quietly coordinating with 2 backup units that were staged further down the highway, waiting for the signal to move in. They were close. They were maybe 5 minutes away from ending a 9-day manhunt. That was the moment Matt Doyle decided to run their plates. Doyle was a 7-year veteran with the state police, assigned to highway patrol on the I-78 corridor. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a way of carrying himself on the road. that his colleagues either admired or quietly complained about, depending on who you asked. He had received 2 formal complaints in the past 3 years, one for an unlawful search, one for use of excessive language during a routine stop, and both had been quietly resolved without serious discipline. People who worked alongside him described him as someone who trusted his instincts. People who had been on the receiving end of those instincts described something else entirely. Doyle had been sitting in a patrol cutout near mile marker 34 when the black Yukon rolled past. He watched it for a few seconds, pulled out, and ran the plate. The vehicle came back clean. Registered, insured, no flags. But Doyle had already made up his mind. He hit his lights. Marcus saw the blue and red flash in his mirror and felt his jaw tighten. He didn't panic. He didn't speed up. He signaled, guided the Yukon smoothly onto the shoulder, and put it in park. Dana looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said a word, but they both understood exactly what was happening and exactly what it was going to cost them. Up ahead, the silver Accord kept moving, steady and unbothered, growing smaller in the windshield with every passing second. Doyle stepped out of his cruiser, adjusted his belt, and walked toward the Yukon like he had all the time in the world. He didn't even know he was already out of time. Doyle reached the driver's side window and didn't wait for it to come all the way down before he started talking. He told Marcus he had been driving erratically back there, a claim that had no basis in anything that had actually happened on that highway. Marcus kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and asked, calmly and clearly, what specifically he had done wrong. Doyle ignored the question. He leaned one forearm on the roof of the Yukon, looked into the car like he was doing an inventory, and told Marcus to hand over his license and registration. Marcus reached for the glove compartment slowly and deliberately, the way anyone trained in law enforcement learns to move during a stop. No sudden gestures, no surprises. He produced his driver's license and the vehicle registration and handed them through the window. Doyle took them without a word, looked them over, and then looked back at Marcus with the kind of expression that told you his mind had already been made up before he ever left his cruiser. Dana sat completely still in the passenger seat. She had her hands folded in her lap, her eyes forward, her breathing steady. She had been in enough tense situations to know that the worst thing either of them could do right now was give Doyle anything to work with. But she was also watching the highway ahead of them, and in the back of her mind, she was tracking every second that the silver Accord was getting further away. She pressed her thumb quietly against the side of her radio without lifting it, a small signal to the backup units that they were delayed, not compromised, just delayed. Doyle came back to the window faster than expected. He handed the license back and told Marcus that the plates on the Yukon had come up flagged during his check. That was a lie, and Marcus knew it was a lie, because a vehicle with federal operational ties goes through a specific kind of registration that does not throw flags on a routine highway scan. But he didn't say that yet. He took the license back, set it on his knee, and asked Doyle in a level voice what flag he was referring to. Doyle didn't answer that either. Instead, he stood up straight, took a small step back from the door, and told Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Marcus didn't move right away, not out of defiance, out of precision. He asked Doyle once more, clearly, what the legal basis for the stop was, and what specific flag he was referencing. Doyle's tone shifted. It got harder and shorter. He said he wasn't going to ask again. He said he had reason to believe the vehicle was involved in suspicious activity, and that if Marcus didn't step out voluntarily, he was going to make the rest of his night significantly more complicated. That phrase, significantly more complicated, landed in the car like a stone dropped in the still water. Dana turned her head slightly toward Marcus. Just slightly. The kind of movement that means nothing to an outsider, but carries a full conversation between two people who know each other well. Marcus gave the smallest nod. They were both thinking the same thing. They had a fugitive moving down that highway. They had backup units staged and waiting. They had a window that was closing by the minute. And right now, a state trooper with a history of bad stops was standing at their door manufacturing reasons to keep them on the shoulder of I-78 based on nothing more than what they looked like sitting inside a clean, registered vehicle. Doyle wasn't finished. He took a step toward the rear of the Yukon and told Marcus he was going to conduct a search of the vehicle based on his suspicion of criminal activity. He mentioned K9. He mentioned that he could have a unit there in under 10 minutes, and that if Marcus had nothing to hide, then none of this should be a problem. The words were casual, but the meaning behind them was not. He was applying pressure, layer by layer, testing to see how far he could push before something gave. Marcus opened his door and stepped out. He stood at his full height, 6'1", composed, completely still, and looked at Doyle without any anger showing on his face at all. That composure visibly unsettled Doyle, though he covered it quickly with more noise. He told Marcus to move to the rear of the vehicle and keep his hands where he could see them. Marcus walked to the back of the Yukon and stood there with his hands loose at his sides. Dana stepped out of the passenger side without being asked and came around to stand near Marcus. Doyle looked at her like her presence was an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. He told her to get back in the vehicle. She told him, politely and firmly, that she preferred to stand. Doyle pulled out his radio and called for backup. And Marcus Webb looked down the highway one more time at the empty stretch of road where a silver Honda Accord used to be. Doyle's backup hadn't arrived yet when Marcus finally moved. Not toward the car, not away from Doyle. He just turned, slowly and deliberately, and looked at him with an expression that had something new in it. The patience was still there, but the waiting was done. He reached into his jacket with 2 fingers and pulled out a credentials wallet. He flipped it open and held it at Doyle's eye level without saying a single word. On one side was a photo ID. On the other side was a gold badge, the kind that doesn't come from a county sheriff's office or a state barracks, the kind that comes from the federal government of the United States of America. United States Marshal, Marcus Webb. Doyle stared at it. His jaw didn't drop, but something behind his eyes shifted. A quick recalculation happening in real time that he was trying hard not to let show on his face. Before he could speak, Dana stepped forward and opened her credentials wallet. Same badge. Same federal seal. Different name. United States Marshal. Dana Webb. The two of them stood there on the shoulder of I-78, badges out, saying nothing, letting the silence do exactly what it needed to do. Then Marcus spoke. His voice was quiet and unhurried, which somehow made every word land harder. He told Doyle that at the moment his lights came on, they were 11 minutes behind a federally wanted fugitive named Derek Holt, a man with a violent criminal history who had cut off his ankle monitor and been on the run for 9 days. He told him that 2 backup units had been staged down the highway, waiting for their signal. He told him that the silver Accord they had been following for the last 12 minutes was now somewhere past exit 13, and pulling further away from all of them with every passing second. Doyle opened his mouth, then closed it. Marcus slowly folded his credentials wallet and put it back in his jacket. He looked at Doyle one last time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the flat, steady eyes of a man who had already decided what happened next wasn't going to be Doyle's choice to make. He reached for his radio. The call Marcus made on that roadside lasted less than 2 minutes. He reported the delay, gave Holt's last known direction, and passed the pursuit to the backup units down the highway. The agents moved fast, but Holt had a 12-minute head start on an open interstate, and by the time they reached exit 13, the silver Accord was parked abandoned behind a gas station with the engine still warm. Derek Holt was gone on foot. A 9-day manhunt that had been minutes away from ending walked out into the dark because a state trooper couldn't let a black couple drive down a highway without a reason to stop them. Doyle stood by his cruiser and watched Marcus and Dana pack back into the Yukon. He didn't apologize. He didn't speak at all. But his body cam had recorded every second of it. Every false claim, every manufactured reason, every threat he had made to 2 federal officers conducting an active operation. He didn't know that yet. He would find out soon enough. The formal complaint was filed before the midnight. The U.S. Marshals Service contacted the state police directly, and by the following morning, Doyle had been placed on administrative desk duty, pending a full internal review. The body cam footage was pulled within 24 hours. When his supervisors watched it, there was no debate about what they were looking at. The false flag claim, the unlawful search threat, the K-9 bluff, all of it captured in clear audio and video with timestamps attached. Doyle was suspended without pay 6 days later. A federal obstruction inquiry was opened shortly after that. Derek Holt was caught 11 days later in Pennsylvania, tracked down through a second tip and a coordinated multi-agency effort. He was taken into custody without incident and transported back to face the charges waiting for him. The manhunt ended, just later than it should have, and harder than it needed to be. Marcus and Dana Webb returned to work the next morning. No press conference, no statement, no fanfare. They were marshals. They had a job to finish, and they finished it. The only thing that changed was that one man with a badge and a bias finally had to answer for what he had been getting away with for years. And it was all on camera.
Let's ride. Folks around here don't see a car like this every day. What exactly are you doing in this neighborhood tonight?
I live here, 2 houses down on the left. Just got home from work.
You live here in a suit after 9 o'clock driving a 70-grand Mercedes? You sure about that?
Sure, it's my car, registered in my name, insurance is in the glove
I'm not
box.
Officer Dale Hutchins had a reputation at the precinct, and not a good one. That night, he spotted a black man driving a clean Mercedes through a predominantly white neighborhood and made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He pulled him over, got in his face, and told him he was one wrong move away from going home in cuffs. What Officer Hutchins didn't know was that the man gripping that steering wheel was an FBI special agent with 14 years of federal service, and every single second of that stop was being recorded. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was a little past 9 p.m. on a Tuesday when Marcus Webb decided to take the long way home. He had just wrapped up a 14-hour day at the FBI field office in Atlanta, Georgia, and the quiet drive through the suburban streets of Crestwood Hills was the only break he was going to get. Marcus was 41 years old, calm by nature and sharp by training. He had spent nearly a decade and a half working federal investigations, organized crime, public corruption, and civil rights violations. He knew how to read a room, how to stay composed under pressure, and more importantly, he knew the law better than most people who swore an oath to uphold it. That night, he was not working. He was just a man in a dark suit, loosening his tie, driving his black Mercedes E-Class through a neighborhood he had every right to be in. He had his jazz playing low. His badge and credentials were in the inner pocket of his jacket, right where they always were. He was 2 miles from his front door when the blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror. Marcus didn't panic. He signaled, pulled over smoothly, and put both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. He had done this before. Not because he was a criminal, but because he was a black man in America, and he understood what that meant the moment those lights came on. The officer who stepped out of that cruiser was Dale Hutchins, a 12-year veteran of the Crestwood Hills Police Department. At 44 years old, Hutchins was the kind of cop that other officers either avoided or quietly covered for. He had 2 formal complaints filed against him in the last 3 years, both involving black male drivers, both involving allegations of aggressive and unnecessary stops. Neither complaint had gone anywhere. His supervisors called him old school. The people he pulled over called him something else entirely. That night, Hutchins had been patrolling the Ridgeway Corridor, a stretch of Crestwood Hills that sat between a lower-income area and one of the wealthiest zip codes in the county. He later claimed he pulled Marcus over because the vehicle's tags came back with a delay in the system. Body cam footage would tell a very different story. Hutchins approached the driver's side slowly, one hand resting near his holster. He didn't greet Marcus. He didn't explain the stop. He shone his flashlight directly into Marcus's face and said, "License, registration, and insurance. Now." Marcus kept his voice level. "Good evening, officer. Can I ask what the reason for the stop is?" Hutchins didn't answer the question. Instead, he stepped closer to the window. "I'm the one asking questions here. Are you going to give me your documents, or are we going to have a problem?" Marcus reached slowly into his glove compartment, narrating every movement the way he was trained to do in the field. Not because policy required it in this situation, but because he knew how fast things could go wrong. He handed over his driver's license and vehicle registration. Hutchins took them without a word and stood there, studying them longer than necessary, his flashlight sweeping the interior of the car like he was looking for something, anything, to justify why he had stopped this man in the first place. "You live around here?" Hutchins asked, his tone making it clear he already doubted the answer. "I do," Marcus said. Hutchins looked at the license, looked at Marcus, then looked back at the license. "This address doesn't match the area you came from." Marcus stayed calm. "I took a different route home." There was a pause, the kind that wasn't really a pause. It was a decision being made, and whatever Hutchins decided in that moment, it was about to cost him everything. Hutchins didn't walk back to his cruiser to run the license like any routine stop would require. He stayed right where he was, leaning against the door of Marcus's car like he owned it. That alone told Marcus everything he needed to know about where this was heading. This was not a traffic stop anymore. This was something else, and Hutchins was just getting started. "Step out of the vehicle," Hutchins said. His voice had shifted. It was flatter now, harder, carrying the kind of authority that wasn't really about the law. It was about control. Marcus didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, but because he was thinking clearly while everything around him was becoming unreasonable. "Officer, I haven't been told why I was pulled over. I haven't been charged with anything. Can you give me a lawful reason to exit the vehicle?" That question lit something up in Hutchins. He pulled the door handle. "I'm not going to ask you again. Get out." Marcus stepped out slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate. He stood at 6 feet tall in a pressed dark suit, tie slightly loosened from the long day. He looked nothing like what Hutchins seemed to have decided he was. But Hutchins wasn't looking at who Marcus actually was. He had already made up his mind before he ever turned those lights on. "Put your hands on the roof," Hutchins ordered. "Am I being detained?" Marcus asked calmly. "Hands on the roof." Marcus complied. And as he stood there, palms flat against the cold metal of his own car, on a quiet street 2 miles from his own home, something was happening that Hutchins had no awareness of. The dash cam on Marcus's personal vehicle, a habit he had developed years ago after working enough cases to know better, was recording every second, The audio was clean. The angle was wide. Nothing was being missed. Hutchins began talking into his radio, calling for a second unit. He cited suspicious behavior and failure to comply. Neither description matched anything that had actually happened. Marcus had answered every question. He had moved slowly and carefully. He had kept his tone respectful, even as his rights were being stripped away on the side of the road like they meant nothing. The backup arrived within 4 minutes. Officer Pete Garrow pulled up behind Hutchins' cruiser and stepped out. Garrow was younger, only 3 years on the force, and the moment he saw Marcus standing calmly with his hands on the roof in a suit, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly buried under the weight of seniority. Hutchins was the senior officer. Garrow was there to support, not to question. Hutchins turned back to Marcus. "You got anything in this car I should know about? Weapons, drugs, anything like that?" "No," Marcus said. "You mind if I search the vehicle?" Marcus turned his head slightly. "I do mind. I do not consent to a search." Hutchins smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "That's fine. I can call a K9 unit out here, and we can all wait together. Could be a while." He said it the way people say things when they want you to know they enjoy having power over you. Marcus said nothing. He understood exactly what was happening. This was a pressure tactic. Make the stop uncomfortable enough, drag it out long enough, and most people will either break down or say something that gives the officer what he's looking for. Hutchins had used this playbook before. He knew how it usually ended. What he didn't know was that Marcus had spent years sitting across from people who used psychological pressure as a weapon. He had interviewed federal suspects, organized crime figures, and corrupt officials who were far more skilled at intimidation than Dale Hutchins would ever be. A threat about a K9 unit on a Tuesday night wasn't going to rattle him. But then Hutchins went further. He stepped close, too close, and lowered his voice so that Garrow couldn't hear clearly. "I don't know what you think this is," he said, "but in this neighborhood, at this time of night, driving a car like this, that's enough for me. You're one wrong move away from going home in cuffs. Or not going home at all." The last 4 words hung in the night air like a threat that had crossed every line that existed. Marcus looked at him steadily and said nothing. But inside, the decision had already been made. He reached slowly toward his jacket. Hutchins's hand moved to his holster. "Hey, what are you reaching for?" "My credentials," Marcus said quietly. "I think it's time you saw them." Marcus reached into the inner pocket of his jacket slowly. 2 fingers, the way you move when you want everyone around you to stay calm. He pulled out a flat black leather case and held it open directly in front of Dale Hutchins' face. The gold badge caught the light from the cruiser behind them. Below it, a federal identification card with Marcus's photo, his name, and 3 words that seemed to take a moment to reach Hutchins' brain. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hutchins didn't speak. His hand was still near his holster, but it wasn't moving anymore. His eyes went from the badge to Marcus's face, then back to the badge, like he was waiting for it to change into something that made more sense to him. It didn't change. Behind them, Officer Garrow had taken a few steps closer. He saw the credentials from where he stood and stopped walking. He didn't say a word either. The whole scene just went quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the moment after something breaks. Marcus closed the case slowly and slid it back into his pocket. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Hutchins with the same steady expression he had carried through the entire stop. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. "I've been a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 14 years, Marcus said. "Every word spoken tonight has been recorded. My dashcam has been running since before you approached my window. I asked you twice for the reason for this stop. You never gave me one. I was ordered out of my vehicle without cause. I was threatened. And I want to make sure you understand that I am referencing your exact words when I say that. Hutchins opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You don't need to say anything right now, Marcus said. But I need you to understand that this stop is not over. It's just moving somewhere else. He got back into his Mercedes, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without another word. In his mirror, he could see Hutchins still standing exactly where he had left him. Badge on his chest, hand at his side, watching the taillights disappear. Some mistakes you know the moment you make them. This was one of those. Marcus Webb did not go home that night and let it go. He sat at his kitchen table, jacket still on, and wrote a detailed incident report. Before he even loosened his tie the rest of the way, every time, every word, every threat. He had been trained to document, and that night he documented everything with the same precision he brought to federal investigations worth millions of dollars. Within 48 hours, the Crestwood Hills Police Department received a formal complaint from the FBI field office in Atlanta. It didn't come through a personal filing. It came through official channels, the kind of channels that make police chiefs sit up straight and call their lawyers before they call anyone else. The dash cam footage was pulled. The body cam footage was reviewed. What the recordings showed lined up exactly with what Marcus had reported, and directly contradicted the account Hutchins had submitted in his own paperwork that same night. Hutchins had written that Marcus was uncooperative and displaying erratic behavior. The footage showed a man in a suit, hands visible, voice calm, asking reasonable questions while being treated like a suspect without a single piece of evidence to justify it. Dale Hutchins was placed on administrative leave within the week. The two previous complaints against him, complaints that had been quietly buried, were pulled back out and added to the growing file. Officer Garrow cooperated fully with investigators. He was a young man who had made the mistake of staying silent in the moment, and he knew it. The city of Crestwood Hills was served with a federal civil rights lawsuit shortly after. The figure attached to it was $7.2 million. The lawsuit cited racial profiling, unlawful detention, excessive use of authority, and civil rights violations under federal law. Dale Hutchins lost his badge before the case ever reached a courtroom. But here's what stays with you, long after the legal details fade. Marcus Webb had a federal badge in his pocket that night, and it still almost wasn't enough. Most black men driving home on a Tuesday don't have that badge. They have the same rights, the same dignity, and the same humanity. And far too often, none of it is treated like it matters. That is the part of this story that doesn't end with a lawsuit.
Hey, don't move. Hands where I can see them. Let's see some papers right now.
Morning, I'm just getting back to my car.
Papers, now. Don't make this harder.
I'm a law enforcement officer. I'm going to reach into my pocket and pull out my credentials. Both hands nice
Right
and slow.
pocket, coming out now.
Special Agent Gabriel Torres, Los Angeles County Sheriff.
ICE agent Marcus Diaz arrived that morning with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. He spotted the man outside the store, and without a single word of greeting, he moved in fast, blocked his path, and told him he wasn't going anywhere. He got in his face, demanded papers, and made it very clear that resisting would end badly. What he didn't know was that the man standing in front of him had spent over 2 decades training the very officers who would one day sign off on his termination papers. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was a regular Saturday morning in Southern California, the kind of morning where the sun comes up early, the streets are quiet, and most people are just trying to get through their errands and get back home. No drama, no tension, just a normal day. At least that's what Victor Ramos thought when he pulled it into the parking lot of his local grocery store and stepped out of his car. Victor Ramos was 44 years old, and he had given more than half his life to law enforcement. He wasn't just a police officer. He was a training academy instructor, the kind of man that departments relied on to shape new recruits and turn them into professionals. He had spent over 2 decades inside classrooms and on training grounds, teaching cadets how to handle pressure, how to de-escalate situations, how to treat people with dignity regardless of where they came from. He knew the law not just as a set of rules, but as something he lived and breathed every single day. On this particular morning, though, none of that was on his mind. He was off duty, dressed in regular clothes, carrying nothing but his keys and his phone. Just a man trying to buy groceries like everybody else in that parking lot. He had just stepped away from his car when he noticed the figure moving toward him with purpose. It wasn't a casual walk. It was the kind of deliberate stride that law enforcement officers recognize immediately. Steady, locked in, with the body language of someone who has already made a decision before saying a single word. Victor noticed it right away, because he had walked that same walk himself hundreds of times over his career. Marcus Diaz was an ICE agent who had been working immigration enforcement in the region for several years. He was known among his colleagues as aggressive and action-oriented, someone who prided himself on quick pickups and clean numbers. To him, the job was about efficiency. You spotted someone who fit a certain profile. You moved on them fast, and you sorted out the details later. On that Saturday morning, he had been running routine operations in the area when Victor Ramos caught his attention. He didn't know Victor's name. He didn't know his rank or his record or his career. What he saw was a Latino man, alone in a parking lot. And in his mind, that was enough to act on. Diaz closed the distance between them quickly, positioning his body to cut off any exit before Victor even had a chance to register what was happening. He didn't introduce himself calmly. He didn't ask a polite opening question. He stepped directly into Victor's space and told him to stop moving. His hand went up, his voice carried authority, and the message was immediate. "You are not free to walk away from me right now." Victor stopped, not out of fear, but out of the trained instinct of a man who understood exactly how these situations worked. He kept his hands visible, his posture steady, and his voice even. He asked Diaz what the problem was. Diaz didn't answer the question. Instead, he told Victor he needed to see identification and proof of status, his tone making it clear he wasn't asking. People in that parking lot were starting to notice. A woman pushing a cart slowed down. A man loading bags into his trunk looked over. Nobody stepped in, but everyone was watching. And Victor Ramos, a man who had spent his entire career standing on the other side of exactly this kind of moment, now found himself standing in the middle of it, in his own neighborhood, on his day off, being treated like a suspect for no reason other than the way he looked. The injustice of it hadn't fully landed yet, but it was coming. Victor Ramos had been in enough tense situations throughout his career to know when something was about to get worse. This was one of those moments. Diaz wasn't slowing down. He was leaning in, and the small crowd forming around them in that parking lot was about to witness something that no amount of training could have fully prepared Victor for. Not because he didn't know how to handle pressure, but because he had never had to handle it like this. As the target, Victor stayed calm. He told Diaz clearly and directly that he was a police officer. He said it without aggression, without panic. The same measured tone he had taught cadets to use when a situation needed to be brought down, not pushed up. He even reached slowly toward his pocket to show his credentials, making every movement visible and deliberate, the way he had instructed hundreds of students to do over the years. For a moment, it seemed like that might be enough. Like Diaz would pause, look at the badge, and let the whole thing dissolve right there in the parking lot. That's not what happened. Diaz looked at the identification. Then he looked back at Victor, And instead of standing down, he told Victor that the credentials needed to be verified, that he wasn't going anywhere until that process was complete. His tone hadn't changed. His posture hadn't softened. In fact, if anything, he seemed more locked in than before, as if the badge had complicated things for him rather than resolved them. And his response to that complication was to dig deeper into his position instead of stepping back from it. This is the moment that defines how powers can go wrong. Not always in the first move, but in the refusal to correct course when the facts are standing right in front of you. Victor kept his composure, but inside, something was shifting. He understood exactly what was happening. He had seen bias operate in real time before, had studied it, discussed it in classrooms, warned young cadets about it, but understanding something intellectually and standing inside it on a Saturday morning in your own neighborhood are two completely different experiences. He asked Diaz again, calmly, to explain the legal basis for the detention. It was a precise question, the kind a trained officer asks, the kind that reveals immediately whether the person across from you knows what they're doing or is just operating on instinct and assumption. Diaz didn't give a clean answer. He deflected, repeated his demand for verification, and called for his partner to come over. His partner arrived within seconds, and now there were two federal agents standing in front of Victor Ramos in a public parking lot, treating a 44-year-old law enforcement instructor like a man with something to hide. The humiliation of that moment was not small. Victor was in his own community. People around him knew him. Neighbors, familiar faces, people who had seen him in uniform, people whose kids he may have coached, or whose family members had gone through the academy. Now they were watching him get hemmed in by federal agents who had decided what he was before he ever opened his mouth. Every second that passed made the scene more visible, more public, and more damaging. But Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any sudden movements. He stood exactly the way he had taught others to stand, grounded, composed, and fully present. Because he knew, with the clarity that comes from decades of experience, that his behavior in this moment mattered, not just for his own safety, but for what came after it. What Diaz hadn't accounted for was that Victor wasn't just remembering what was happening. He was documenting it in his mind, with the precision of a man who knew exactly how investigations work, exactly what details matter in a courtroom, and exactly what a pattern of conduct looks like when it's laid out in front of a judge. Every word Diaz said, every action he took, every second of that unlawful detention was being cataloged by the one person in that parking lot most qualified to understand its full legal weight. Diaz kept pushing. He told Victor the process would take as long as it needed to take. He said it like a man who had never once had to answer for how long he made someone wait, or why, or on what grounds. That comfort, that ease of assumption, was about to run out completely. The verification came back, and when it did, the entire energy in that parking lot shifted in an instant. Whatever Diaz had been expecting to see on that screen, it was not what appeared. Victor Ramos was not an undocumented migrant. He was not a man with something to hide. He was a credentialed, active law enforcement officer with over 2 decades of service. A man who held an official position training police cadets at an academy, the kind of institution that exists to produce the very people Diaz worked alongside every single day. The badge was real. The credentials were real. All of it was exactly what Victor had said it was from the very first moment Diaz stepped into his path. Diaz went quiet. His partner went quiet. The confidence that had carried both of them through the entire confrontation didn't fade gradually. It collapsed. There was no smooth recovery, no professional pivot, no clean way to walk back what had just happened in front of witnesses, in a public parking lot, on a Saturday morning. Victor looked at him and said nothing for a moment. He didn't need to. The silence did more than any words could have. What this moment exposed went far beyond one agent's mistake. It revealed something systemic. The assumption that a Latino man in casual clothes in a parking lot in his own neighborhood was a problem that needed to be solved before a single fact was confirmed. Diaz had built his entire approach that morning on a foundation of bias. And when that foundation gave way, there was nothing underneath it. Victor had known men like Diaz his entire career. He had warned cadets about becoming men like Diaz. He had stood in front of classrooms and explained in plain language exactly how assumption becomes action, and action becomes injustice. And now he had lived it himself, in full, with witnesses. He picked up his keys, he straightened his jacket, and he walked toward his car with the same steady calm he had carried through every second of that confrontation, because he had already decided, before Diaz ever said another word, that this moment was not going to end in that parking lot. It was going to end in a courtroom. Victor Ramos didn't go home that day and let it go. He sat down, documented everything while it was fresh, and contacted legal representation within days of the incident. He wasn't driven by anger. He was driven by something much more focused than that. He had spent his entire career teaching young officers that accountability was not optional, that the badge came with responsibility, and that no one in law enforcement was above the standards they swore to uphold. Now, he was going to prove he believed every word of it. The lawsuit was filed against the federal government, and what came out during the legal process was damaging. Victor's legal team laid out the confrontation in precise detail. The lack of legal basis for the stop, the refusal to stand down after credentials were presented, the public nature of the humiliation, and the undeniable fact that the only thing that triggered Diaz's actions that morning was the color of Victor's skin. There was no other explanation, no other factor, nothing except assumption dressed up as procedure. The federal government fought it, but the evidence was clear. The witnesses were real, and Victor Ramos was not the kind of man who could be dismissed or discredited on a stand. He was composed, credible, and precise, exactly the kind of witness that wins cases. The jury awarded him $12.9 million. It was one of the largest verdicts of its kind, and it sent a message that traveled far beyond that courtroom. It told every federal agency operating on bias that there is a cost. It told every Latino officer, every minority professional, every person who has ever been reduced to a stereotype in a parking lot that their dignity has value. Legal, documented, quantifiable value. Victor spoke after the verdict with the same calm he had carried through everything. He said the money was never the point. The point was that what happened to him happens to people every single day who don't have a badge, don't have legal resources, and don't have 2 decades of credibility to fall back on. He wanted this case to be the one that people pointed to. Proof that silence was never the answer. Marcus Diaz had walked into that parking lot, certain he had power. Victor Ramos walked out of that courtroom, having redefined what power actually looks like. Marcus Diaz had walked into that parking lot, certain he had power. Victor Ramos walked out of that courtroom, having redefined what power actually looks like.